If at this point you have come to the conclusion that most conditions are not independent of each other, then you would be correct. Conditions interact in a variety of ways, and this holds true in many instances where water temperature and clarity are concerned. Other than the time of year, which is obviously a big factor, water temps and clarity, as they relate to fishing, become condition dependent. Here's a few quick examples, most of which have been previously mentioned as part of other condition sets. On ocean beaches, a strong onshore wind or storm will kick up large waves, which in turn stir up and move around the sand, resulting in poor water clarity. Offshore winds generally produce calmer seas and clearer water. In inlets, the incoming tide brings cooler and most times cleaner water into the bay, and the opposite holds true for the outgoing. In the connected bays, a strong cold wind can drop water temps in a hurry, and an outgoing tide can pull warm water off the flats and into the connecting channels. All of these can and will affect fishing. The stage of the moon has basically three effects. The first effect is on the tide. The full and new moons produce the highest and lowest tides in each month. The second effect is important for those who fish at night, and that is that the full moon provides the lightest nights and the new moon produces the darkest nights. And the third effect is that many species of fish mate, spawn, or migrate based on the stage of the moon. There is a ton of info on the internet on reading tide tables, tide coefficients, names for the various stages of the moons, and other related stuff if you're interested, so I'm not going to go into it here. I'll just say that what is important is what kind of impact the above three effects has on the type of fishing you do and the species you seek. The last set of conditions is the time of day and the amount of ambient light. Not a whole lot of explanation is required here. The short version is that most fish have a preferred amount of light when they feed. Dawn and dusk are fairly popular times of day for fishing because many species feed under those low light conditions. The same holds true for cloudy days versus bright sunny ones. Some fish feed mostly at night, with some liking the full moon and others the new moon. That pretty much sums up the basic scenarios. The real trick, where analyzing conditions is concerned, is understanding what conditions are most important for the time of year, the time of day, the species sought, and the location you plan on fishing. Prioritizing conditions is key, and some of this should be obvious. For example, 3 days into a strong onshore blow, the ocean front is going to have giant waves, beat up shoreline, and water the color of coffee, so it doesn't matter that you caught fish there before on a particular stage of tide or lunar stage, or any other set of conditions for that matter. The wind has blown out the fishing and rendered all the other conditions moot. But in a nearby back bay location, that same wind may not have dirtied up the bay water and may have blown bait to a particular location that has produced before under similar wind conditions. In this case, the conditions dictated where you had the best chance to catch fish. Fishing is chock full of situations such as these. In my first video of the series, I laid out the 4 elements I considered important in developing an effective strategy for catching fish consistently. At this point, I'm going to go through a couple of detailed examples of how I use these 4 elements to develop dependable seasonal patterns for the species I fish for. And while the specifics of the following examples take place on the South Shore of Long Island, New York, on the northeast coast of the U.S., this methodology can be used anywhere fish swim. This first example is an early spring pattern that I fished for close to 20 years. Here's how it fits together. Component 1 is fish species, in this case the striped bass, a fish I've pursued for more than 40 years. I've read everything I could on them, studied their habits, migrations, stock assessments, management practices, pretty much everything, and after 40 years I've come to the conclusion that catching them is really not that hard. The real trick is finding them consistently. Component 2 is bait species. Well, for striped bass, that's pretty easy as they eat just about everything. So basically the bait I need to be concerned with is whatever bait is available at the time of the year that I'm fishing. As this scenario takes place in early spring, the bait in the bay where I'm fishing tends to be small white bait and grass shrimp, which can be a problem to match sometimes. Component 3 is structure. Striped bass will relate to bottom structure when it's available. It provides a feeding advantage, and as I've covered this topic in other videos, I'll leave it at that. This particular spot is a channel with sandbars running across it. It is connected to a large, shallow area of the bay. Component 4 is conditions, the topic of this video. In this example, stable weather is important. Tide is outgoing, about 3 hours in, right through to near low slack. Current follows tide by about an hour and a half at this location. Any wind except hard north is okay, with southerlies the best of the lot. Water temps are warmer during the outgoing tide, and if the water is dirty, forget it and go home. Any lunar stage around the new moon will do. Full moon, not so great. Time of day is early evening, and the ambient light is the darker the better. Bass prefer to feed at night in this area. Here's what makes this pattern tick. The early striped bass are mostly non-migrating fish that have wintered over in the bay. As spring approaches, they shake off the cold water stupor and put the feed bag on. As mentioned earlier, they'll eat most any available bait. Stable weather and outgoing tide are the key conditions here. The reason is that the shallow bay waters have had a chance to warm up in the late afternoon sun, and the dark mud bottom of much of the area helps this process. The warmer water gets the small zooplankton blooming, which triggers a food chain event. The small baits start feeding on the zooplankton, and as the tide moves out, they all get washed into the channel where the warmer water remains near the surface. The structure, in this case, is the sandbars, which force the bait into a constrained area where the striped bass are waiting to pick them off. Because the bait is small and near the surface, I'll throw a small profile plug with a teaser that mimics the bait I see. The plug should cast well and work in the upper water column. That pretty much sums up this pattern in a nutshell. Daytime, stay home. Dirty water, go home. Incoming tide, don't even leave home. Strong northerlies blew the food chain elsewhere, so go find them. But when everything aligns just right, it's lights out fishing. This next example is a late spring and late fall pattern that I put together over a period of years. Here's how it fits together. Component 1 is fish species, again the striped bass, so nothing more needs to be said about that. Component 2 is bait species. In this location, it took a while for me to figure out what they were feeding on, and while striped bass will eat anything, in this case they were focused on the ground fish that inhabit the area during that time of year. There's a longer story behind this, but cutting open the stomachs of some of the fish I kept helped in solving the puzzle. Component 3 is structure. This particular spot has a very defined productive area. Basically, it's a narrow channel that you wade out to the edge of and then cast to the far side of the channel. There is a cove on the far side and a submerged point running into the channel. The flats on the far side are fairly shallow, running 1 to 3 feet depending upon the stage of the tide. Component 4 is conditions, again, the topic of this video. In this example, prime conditions are outgoing tide around 1 hour in, right through to low slack. Current follows tide by about an hour and a half at this location. Any west wind is good, any east wind is bad. Water temps are warmer during the outgoing tide, and water should be reasonably clear. Any lunar stage will do, with new and full moons good, but for different reasons. Time of day is night, and the ambient light is dark, as bass prefer to feed at night in this area. Here's what drives this pattern. We already know that striped bass relate to bottom structure. In this location, outgoing tide and west winds are the key conditions. Outgoing tide runs left to right, and as the tide recedes, any bait fish on the flats are forced into the deeper water of the channel and the adjacent cove. So the cove edge and the submerged point make ideal ambush points for the bass. The actual bay is long and narrow in an east-west configuration. So a west wind is important because it moves the outgoing current quicker, while an east wind will slow up the current. The stronger the current, the more advantage the bass have while feeding, and the more reason they'll have to stay put on that structure. While lunar stages are not key factors here, the new and full moons do help move the current faster. They also play a role where ambient light conditions are concerned. During the late spring pattern, I prefer the new moon and the darkness it provides, as it tends to keep the fish very localized to the structure. But during the fall pattern, bioluminescence in the water can be a problem on dark nights, as it glows easily when disturbed by your fishing line. So when the fire is in the water, I tend to fish under a bright moon, which lessens the visibility of the bioluminescence. In all cases, I fish this area mostly with live eels because the bass are focused on ground fish and feeding on or near the bottom, and because I can fish eels without a lot of pressure on the fishing line, I can keep the disturbance of bioluminescence to a minimum. These two examples are just stripped-down versions of the whole process that are really just to illustrate how to prioritize conditions for the various species you fish for and the areas you fish for them in. The end objective is to develop a catalog of patterns and locations so that you have options based on whatever set of conditions exist. In the above example, the west wind is important. So if the wind is blowing from the east, I might opt to fish a location on the other side of the inlet, where the outgoing tide runs with the wind, or more accurately, west to east. Or I may opt to fish the inlet based on some other subset of conditions, or even switch to a completely different species. And that's why conditions matter so much, because over time, they tell you where to fish and what to fish for. At this point, I'll close by saying that these videos are meant only to illustrate how I approach fishing in general. I'm not saying that my way is the only way. It's just the way I organize my thoughts, a framework that I develop patterns on, so to speak. Hopefully, I have given you some things to think about, and maybe these videos can help you organize your learning process a little more efficiently. Anybody can catch fish during a blitz, but to catch fish consistently, you have to dig a little deeper. For me, fishing has been a lifelong journey that continues to this day, and I've loved every minute of it. Hopefully you're enjoying your journey also. That's my view from the beach. So until next time, be well and catch 'em up.